Welcome to what is the third Witness Seminar in a series that is part of a global research project, World Christian Community and the Cold War. The project presently has over 20 participating national projects, and the aim is eventually to have world coverage in order to build up a collaborative network examining how the universal church met the global challenge of the Cold War conflict. Despite the long neglect accorded religion as an important variable in the Cold War, the last decade has witnessed not only a proliferation of scholarship on the subject, but even the attribution of causal significance. As the religious dimension of the 20th century's dominant struggle becomes established as a subgenre of Cold War studies, this Witness Seminar brings together key players in what can now most certainly be called the religious Cold War, to examine Christian responses either side of the East-West divide. My name is Diane Kirby. I'm a Cold War scholar on the coordinating committee of the research project World Christian Community and the Cold War. I'm joined today by three very distinguished Christian activists who also happen to be scholars of religion, history, politics, and theology. Norman Hjelm, Charles West, and Paul Moises. I'm going to begin by asking each in turn briefly to introduce themselves, after which I will begin with the first question intended to start their conversation about their Cold War as churchmen. Over to you, Norman.
I'm Norman Hjelm, and undoubtedly the person with the least experience or insight concerning this subject. I was, for 6 years, Director of Communication and for a while Deputy General Secretary of the Lutheran World Federation in Geneva. And I retired as Director of the Department of Faith and Order for the National Council of Churches in this country. I'm a member of the coordinating committee, and I'm attempting to learn more and more.
Charles.
I'm Charles West, and my last job was Professor of Christian Ethics at Princeton Theological Seminary. Before that, I was an associate director of the Ecumenical Institute, Bossey, of the World Council of Churches. And before that, I wrote a dissertation on communism and the theologians. And before that, I was in Germany for 2 years, and that's where I'm really interested in talking about. And before that, I was a missionary in China. So, well, I should mention that I am an ecumenical Christian. I had to join a church, so I went to the counselor to Protestant students at Columbia, where I was in college, and I said, how can I join a church and the least self-conscious denomination possible? And he sent me to the Presbyterians, and I've never regretted it.
My name is Paul Moises. I'm a native of Yugoslavia. I came to this country in 1957 as a student and then decided to stay. I'm a United Methodist, but I'm also an ecumenical Christian. One of the ways in which I expressed my ecumenism is that for the last 30 or so years, 40 years actually, I've been teaching religious studies at a Roman Catholic college in suburban Philadelphia named Rosemont College. I've also been very active in the same organization in which you have been active. Both of us were presidents of Christians Associated for Relationships with Eastern Europe, whose primary task indeed was, as the name indicates, to build these contacts and bridges between Christians in the United States and also in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe.
Right, let me kick us off with our first question. The concept behind the Witness Seminar was to explore the Cold War challenge to the Christian churches. However, what I am discovering from the churchmen that I've so far encountered is that, in fact, you were challenging the Cold War. As Paul Ostreicher stated in the very first witness seminar, his enemy was the Cold War. Is that a sentiment that you can identify with?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we are all Christians and we were concerned with the witness to God in Jesus Christ on both sides of the Iron Curtain. That was our primary interest. That transcended all politics. Mm-hmm. Now, whether we could assent to the Cold War, the concept is we didn't like, but the fact was that there was a nuclear standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States, and we had to deal with that. So we had to work on both sides of the Iron Curtain, nevertheless.
Yes, the Cold War was actually a reality which we could not negate.
That's right.
But we could try to see if we could lessen some of the tensions. Some of the tensions were artificially being pumped up by sort of cold warriors on both sides of that big divide. There was a relatively small but somewhat influential group of us who were trying to see if we can, first of all, maintain the contacts between Christians on both sides of the Iron Curtain that were being artificially increased by the day, so that the wall was not only in Berlin, the wall was indeed along the entire divide between East and West. And some of us, for various reasons, had a strong interest in keeping relationships alive and trying also to interpret what was going on the other side of the Iron Curtain to Christians in our own backyard, because we ourselves were fairly well divided in terms of our attitudes toward the Cold War. There were among Christians in the US, and I'm sure in other Western European countries, who were Cold Warriors, who really were eager to sort of see if their actions could bring about a demise, not only of the system, but actually oftentimes there was the danger that a nuclear war could break out and civilization as we know it would have been destroyed. So we were trying to contribute to peacemaking wherever that was possible.
As I saw the Ministry of Christians Associated for Relationships with Eastern Europe, in which we were both involved, we were trying to find I won't say a middle ground, because we were trying to transcend the contrast between the fellow travelers on one side, who felt that the Soviet Union was the great future, and we had to go along with, at least be friendly with it, and the other side, who felt that the only true Christians behind the Iron Curtain were persecuted Christians, and that they were constantly emphasizing the persecution. We were trying to help the churches in Eastern Europe to bear their witness and to strengthen their faith, and through contacts. I have to bring in an example. We spent 2 years, my wife and I, and incidentally 2 children, we spent 2 years in Berlin, primarily for contacts with East Germans. Now, we were too young to really be official representatives. We were just fraternal workers, but they regarded us from the East as witnesses and examples of the ecumeny, as they called it, the ecumenical movement.
What dates was this, Charles, that you and your wife were in Berlin? What dates?
Oh, this was 1951 to 53.
So this is actually a very hot part of the Cold War, because the Korean War is the backdrop.
Exactly. Yeah. I was invited by a German pastor to eat lunch in the East, in East Berlin, with there were many government officials there, and he said it really didn't make any difference, did it, which side was responsible for the Korean War. And I said, on the contrary, and I muffed it completely, because all the East German government officials were listening, and I said the wrong thing.
Can I just put a historical context into this, because this period is very important. The inaugural assembly of the World Council of Churches in 1948. 1948, August 1948, in Amsterdam. Visitor Hooft, who was the General Secretary, said that the assembly was not going to allow itself to be instrumentalized by either East or West. And this is reflected in the resolutions, where more or less the ecumenical movement said, we won't go with the West and capitalism, nor will we go with the East and communism. We have to find a third way. However, in 1950, the outbreak of the Korean War, the World Council of Churches does support the UN action. And so a divisive factor comes in at the very beginning, because the Chinese president actually then resigns his post. So the Cold War conflict, after that courageous stance in 1948, Korea does bring the Cold War conflict into the ecumenical movement, despite those transcendent ideals. So your reaction isn't unusual.
No. On the other side, one of the presidents of the World Council of Churches, elected in 1948, incidentally, there were 7 presidents representing the spread of the ecumenical movement. Hjelm resigned from his presidency because of the action of the World Council of Churches in regard to the invasion of Korea.
So I think what's important there is that you do see the Cold War in the very first 2 or 3 years of the ecumenical movement's existence becoming a divisive factor. And this is why your challenge to that division is so critical, is so important.
The World Council of Churches itself was challenging the concept of the Cold War. The basis of its decision in 1951 was precisely they were rejecting invasion and the and military action by the Soviets and the Eastern Bloc, military action to try to conquer a part of the West. That was the basis on which they backed the UN action.
So as a young man in East Germany, you with your wife, you felt inclined to the American side, but at the same time you recognized the depth of Christian sentiment that existed
I was provoked. I shouldn't have responded that way in that center. I should have recognized that I had to bear a Christian witness to these communist officials who were sitting in the restaurant, not an American position.
But oftentimes we were put into these difficult positions to decide when one should be diplomatic and watch out how one says things lest one makes things worse for Christians over there, but also for the relationship between East and West. And then there was also the need at times to speak boldly the truth to power. And I think our role oftentimes, and Charles, you know that very well in the Christian Peace Conference, was we could say things as Americans at those fora that Eastern Europeans were dying to say but did not dare to say because it would have ended their careers and their work, and churches would be closed. And there were times, by the way, when we felt like we should quit because of some incidents, like, for instance, the invasion of the Soviet bloc into Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring, and terminating the Prague Spring. And indeed, a lot of Western groups did terminate their relationships at that time. And we struggled mightily in order to justify our staying with the process, because we were being asked by Christians privately. They could never say that in public, but privately they would approach us and say, please don't leave, because your presence here is terribly important for us to be able to have a more balanced discussion about these issues.
Where can I start to comment on this?
Anywhere you want.
Backing you up. Let me start with Carolee Todt.
Okay.
Carolee Todt was finally a bishop of the Reformed Church in Hungary. The Reformed Church in Hungary is the only Reformed church in the world that has bishops. Yeah. But he was bishop. But earlier, he was the Ecumenical Secretary of the Hungarian Council of Churches. And as such, he was also involved in the Christian Peace Conference. And he drew me aside in Nairobi, Kenya, at the World Alliance of Reformed Churches meeting. You know, you're outside of the both of our spheres of influence. Mm-hmm. And he said, this was after. I have to go. This the Christian Peace Conference condemned the working committee of the Christian Peace Conference condemned the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Thank you. 68. But the next year when it met, it was completely taken over by the Russian Orthodox and so on. And they dismissed the general secretary, who was Czech.
Yes.
And Hromadka resigned from the presidency of the Christian Peace Conference, and then died.
Yes, soon
3 months later. I think of a broken heart.
Maybe.
It was his great vision. But now, what I'm talking when I'm mentioning Carolee Todt, it was 2 years later. It was 1970. Mm-hmm. And he said, I've been asked to be General Secretary of the Christian Peace Conference. I said, I gave him all the reasons why it was impossible. It lost all credibility in the West, and therefore it couldn't be a basis of dialogue anymore. And he said, you have told, your reasons are reasons why I should take it. And he was right.
Yeah.
Because he said, as long as I am there, I can invite Western participation in meetings of the Christian Peace Conference in Eastern Europe, and you can say whatever you want to. Mm-hmm. And he was good as his word. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was suspicious of him
at first,
early,
right?
But I came to trust him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now I could go ahead.
One thing, perhaps we can go back to and you can talk about the beginning of the Christian Peace Conference. Talk about Hromadka, the inspiration behind it, the vision. But I think what's important for people in the West to understand is that from the Western perspective, the political perspective, the Christian Peace Conference was simply a communist front. And so the decision on your parts as American churchmen to have, if you will, an American branch, I'm very interested in that step, because at that time in 1964, again, still a very hot Cold War, and I'm sure that would have been a decision that was not widely understood, shall we say.
I've got to talk about Joseph Hromadka. Joseph Hromadka was a Czech theologian. He had escaped from Czechoslovakia just before Hitler took it over, and came to Princeton Seminary, where he was from 1938 to 1947, and 9 years. And then he decided to go back to Czechoslovakia and take his place there, even though there was threat of communist takeover, which happened a year after he arrived. He accepted the coup d'état, whereby the communists. He incidentally was friends with many of the communist leaders who took over, and he thought, this is where we are. This is where we are called to be Christians. And I know these communists. I know their heart is in many cases in the right place. They have to obey the Soviet Union, really. But when the Soviet Union organized the World Peace Council and tried to bring the churches into it, Hromadka said, "You'll get nowhere with that. The churches just they'll say they'll give assent, but they won't participate really. So let me organize a Christian peace conference, and you can have your people in there, and the Christian Peace Conference was, in his mind, an accommodation to the Soviet line, because all of its resolutions produced the Soviet idea of peace. But it was also a place of dialogue. I was at the 1964 assembly of the Christian Peace Conference, and Hromadka came along and clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Charles, I hope you are talking with many people." That was his real agenda, to get people talking and to get Easterners talking with Westerners. So this was he was hoping to influence, and he thought he had influenced the communists. And in 1968, the Prague Spring was, to a large extent, his success. And at the same time, he was trying to perform, to facilitate a dialogue between East and West.
Would you go back 20 years before that, back to Amsterdam, and the celebrated encounter between Hromadka and John Foster Dulles?
Yes.
Reflect on that a little bit.
Were you there?
No, my first time was 1952 at the Lutheran World Federation Assembly.
I wasn't there
And the
either.
World Student Christian Federation.
I thought Hromadka's and John Foster Dulles' conflict was in Evanston, Illinois. At the time.
No.
Already started.
I was at Evanston.
Amsterdam.
This is Amsterdam.
That's what the two speeches.
Started out. I
Yeah.
see. Okay.
Yeah, that was Amsterdam, 1948. You remember?
I was at Evanston.
So was I.
Good. Yes, those two speeches should be read now in the light of the failure of communism and the in the 1948, the third section of the report of the assembly, which was on responsibility for the church and society. They condemned both laissez-faire capitalism and communism, and gave why and the reasons why. And this was in echo of what Mr. Tuft had to say about that. And that was the concept of responsible society was an effort to take account of those criticisms of both sides and to project a more just society and to influence both sides in that direction.
We're inclined to understand the encounter between Hromadka and Dulles in terms of Dulles' later career more than who he was in 1948. He was there not as the American Secretary of State or anything like that. He was a Presbyterian layman.
That's right.
Of considerable conviction and importance.
Yeah.
And
a representative of the Federal Council of Churches.
exactly. Yeah.
But he also did work with the Truman administration, and in that period, Harry Truman was trying to construct an international anti-communist religious front. He'd already had an exchange of letters with Pius XII, and he made an approach to Visitor Hooft to bring the World Council of Churches into the front. And then afterwards, in 1949, he flew the new Ecumenical Patriarch, Athenagoras, to Istanbul in his presidential plane. So Dulles was aware that the Americans did want to use religion, and obviously we're aware from World War II that Stalin also, for his own domestic and international reasons, wanted to use religion. And I think what's important about 1948 is that there was an awareness on the part of those participating churches that each side in the Cold War wanted to instrumentalize them, and that this had to be resisted. This would undermine, if you will, their witness. So, from the very start, they take that position, but it's a very hard position, as we mentioned with Korea, and as you mentioned from your personal experience, to sustain. So by 1964, by which time the Cold War is well entrenched, I think it's very significant that you set up the organisation that you do set up, which is bound to be a suspect organisation to many ordinary Americans and certainly fellow Christians. So perhaps you could talk about what made you take that step. Because I know it was, I've looked at your archives, and there were all sorts of difficulties, including finding the money to run what would be seen by many as something that's in collaboration with a communist front. So perhaps you could talk to us about that time in 1964, when you make your own, if you will, courageous stand against the Cold War.
A word about our reaction to the Soviet invasion and the taking over of the Christian Peace Conference by the Russian Orthodox and all of their satellite people. We in the United States were always a committee for the Christian Peace Conference, not of the Christian Peace Conference, so that we did not have to follow their line. And we had a member of the working committee. He was a Church of the Brethren, Harold Rao, of blessed memory, and he tried hard to modify the Soviet control over the Christian Peace Conference, and finally, we even invited the general secretary, Polish general secretary Makowski, I believe his name was, to our annual meeting, and so we tried to influence him, but finally we realized that two things. First of all, we could not allow a fellow traveling group to be organized on our left. So, and secondly, that there were other possibilities of relationships with Eastern Europe, and which we could explore. So we became Christians Associated for Relationships with Eastern Europe, and for a long time we had as a subtitle, and for
an ecumenical organization for peace and justice, and for relationships with all, something like that.
I think we had the Christian Peace Conference in there too.
Oh yeah, and for relations with the Christian Peace Conference.
That's right.
It's a long, cumbersome title. By the way, that was the first year when I started relating to the organization. And I remember very well the very painful discussion when this Polish Catholic layman had become temporarily the secretary of the Christian Peace Conference, not the president. Metropolitan Nicodim was already the president, I think. And it was a very difficult struggle that we had. Should we actually disband? Should we just say, okay, that's the end, we cannot work with these folks any longer? It's too clear that we don't really have that much of an influence. And then we ended up finding that in-between position where we were no longer that closely associated with CPC. But on the other hand, we also wanted to explore all kinds of other channels, and which we did actually. We had found then, this is when we became interested in sort of the Christian Marxist dialogue. This is when we tried to discover new avenues for peace relationships through the Vienna group, Rudolf Weiler and Vladimir Bruskov, and we started having a series of East-West peace dialogues that were
What was his or Weiler's organization?
Well, it was called the Peace Research Center of the Catholic Theological Faculty at the University of Vienna. And he was the social ethicist of that group.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And he initiated a very interesting kind of a contact with the International Peace Institute, which was clearly a Soviet front agency situated in Vienna also,
Vienna.
because Vienna was that city like Berlin divided into 4 zones, and the Soviets got the right to have their institutions present in Vienna. And
But at that time, it was the capital of an independent Austria.
Yes, indeed. So, we diversified our contacts and became interested in other. And of course, in the meantime, by the way, the political situation tended to improve, so that travel to Eastern Europe was not solely possible through an invitation by the Russian Orthodox Church or by CPC. We were able to then travel also sort of in our own ways and make contacts not only with the official representatives of the churches, but also with dissidents. And so we were able to play a fairly nuanced role, which of course was not understood and appreciated by those people on the right of us who were critical of us and basically assumed that we were stooges in the hands of the KGB and related agencies. Of course, in the East, they thought that we were CIA agents. In the West, they thought that we were KGB agents, and we were neither.
I think that you and I both have a file in the Stasi files
Probably.
and in the CIA files.
Probably. I've never been interested enough to check it.
No, right.
One of the points that was made by John Arnold, the former Dean of Durham, who, as you know, was involved in the British side, if you will, with the East-West Relations Committee, one of the points he made about the importance of these sorts of witness seminars is that very often these intelligence files, either side of the divide, are tainted because they've been used for malicious reasons to slander people and the actions, to sort of support a construct of history that suits the present political order, if you will. So, for instance, he was very concerned about the fact that prior to the end of the Cold War, everybody dismissed everything that came out of Eastern Europe. Whereas since the Cold War, they tend to believe everything that comes out. But he feels that the archives are not reliable, and the importance of this sort of conversation in particular is very important, if you will, to identify who are the good communists, the noble communists, particularly in Christian circles.
Yeah.
So again, in the first seminar, Paul Ostreicher talked about Nicodeme, and he talked about the great Nicodeme. And I'm just wondering, because this had to be a challenge for you, dealing with Christians from when you knew that many of them had their instructions before they went to various conferences or whatever meetings were being held from the communist authorities. How did you discern who you could trust?
I've got to talk about Nicodeme in this regard. I first met him when he came to Bossey, and he was a jolly fellow. He liked his wine, and he was just an ebullient kind of guy. That was in late 1950s, I think. When the National Council of Churches organized a delegation to go at the invitation of the Russian churches, which meant the Russian Orthodox Church, really primarily, and Nicodeme. The question was, how far could we trust Nicodeme? And we had not trusted Nikolai, who had died in 58 or 59. We just didn't trust him. But question is, should we trust Nicodemus? We were in his hands, I remember Eugene Carson Blake, who was then stated clerk of the Presbyterian. Was he already General Secretary of the World Council of Churches?
No, I don't think so.
No, he came later. That came later. He was Presbyterian representative. He said, I trust that man.
I see.
He said, I see him enthusiastically participate in the liturgy. And he talks. That is where his heart is. His heart is in the church. Then in 1972, we said, we sent another National Council of Churches delegation to the Soviet Union, but this was more substantive. We had papers, they had papers, and so on. But we said, we want to talk to Marxist philosophers in the Soviet Union. And we we made this request known to Archbishop Juvenali, who was a young man, you're a fairly young man, younger than us. and he was flustered. He wasn't sure about that. And he said, I'll ask. But Nicodemus said, I'll organize it. And he sat there through the whole session where we engaged in controvery with Marxist philosophers and grinned the whole time. Right. These were things that they would like to say, but they couldn't.
Could not, right. Yeah.
Going back again to something that Paul Ostreicher talked about, he said there were scoundrels. In certain churches there were scoundrels, but he said you had to love them as well, because at the end of the day, through their activities in that Christian sphere, they were preserving the faith. He said he found it very hard to love them. But I'm still interested in how do you discern who were the scoundrels who put politics and their careers first and foremost, and who were more genuine. And certainly I think that point that you made, because the Archbishop of York, when he went to the Soviet Union during World War II, and watched the Patriarch and the Metropolitans, exactly as you said, performing the liturgy, felt afterwards, these are Christians, and as Christians I can trust them. So what were the measures you each used to decide who can we trust?
Well, some people choose, I think, the wrong measures. I have a very close friend whom some of you know in the Slovak Republic, Julius Filo. He's been identified in an American book as a fellow traveler. He was my colleague in Geneva. He became bishop of the Lutheran Church in the Slovak Republic, and he's a professor now at the Ecumenical University in Bratislava. And he said to me, I discussed this with him and showed him, I gave him the book. It was a Harvard professor who identified him that way. And he said, the only piece of evidence they have is that every month I had to report to the authorities in Bratislava. And I had to get their permission to join the staff of the Lutheran World Federation in Geneva. And he said, by that token, we are all fellow travelers, because you couldn't be a citizen of the country without reporting. And that criteria is not going to tell you who the scoundrels were, any more than it tells you who the really faithful people were.
But for instance, his predecessor as a bishop, Jan Mihalko, I would put him in the category of a fellow traveler.
Yes. Yeah.
Julius Philo, I would
If
not.
you agree?
Here's
I
how
would
I
agree, yeah.
personally reacted. I think some of it came to me due to where I grew up. I grew up in a communist country, not as severe a form of communism as in the Warsaw Pact group of communist countries. But growing up there, one developed a kind of a sense for where people
Yes.
stand.
Yes.
Now, of course, it means that you got to know them. You got to talk to them, and before too long, one sensed where they were kind of standing. Now, another thing that was very important is to read up on what was happening in those countries. You could tell because the communist countries differ tremendously one from each other.
Yes.
And the problem that was taking place in the West is that oftentimes they looked at the whole group as if they were all like, let's say,
Yep.
in the Soviet Union or in Bulgaria, let's say, which were some of the more severe oppressive countries. Whereas in other countries like Poland and like certain times in Czechoslovakia went in and out of the oppressive and the more permissive and so on. I think one could get a fairly good sense. My advantage, by the way, as being an American from Eastern Europe was that people could quickly say, you know how it is.
Yeah.
Because we have to say publicly this and that. But you can see through what we are saying.
Yeah.
We don't have the full freedom to speak up exactly how we feel. But privately, oftentimes, we would sit down with people and they would say, well, you know how it is, you know.
Really,
And we did. And in that, by the way, from that perspective, I didn't trust Nicodim that much.
Oh, really?
I had a more, not negative, I wouldn't say negative. I think he was a victim of his time. There was only, he probably did the right thing in the context of the society in which he lived. Perhaps the only really good thing that he was able to do. All the other alternatives that were in front of him would have been a lot worse for the church than what he had selected to do. So from that perspective, I understand where he was. But on the other hand, he did become in some way a tool for being manipulated by his government. As sometimes, by the way, our own leaders here in the United States, church leaders, were also somewhat manipulated by the system.
One of the great gifts of the modern ecumenical movement was surely the fact that there was contact and communication and consequently trust and knowledge of each other. There were no predecessor organizations in a way, and we scarcely knew Christians from other parts of the world. And the ecumenical movement has brought us together. It didn't make us infallible in our judgments by any means, but it gave possibilities. We could say to our government, no, not all Russians are that way, because we know in the church something different, even though some in the church were that way, were scoundrels, as you put it before. Yeah, well, you go ahead.
Yeah. Orthodox are different from Protestants. And their concept of the church and its relationship to the culture of the nation and therefore to the government is different. I came home from this 1962 visit, impressed with the St. Sergius's cell in, where was that place?
Kiev?
Zagorsk.
Zagorsk.
And here was a series of pictures around the wall. One was him going out into the wilderness and praying. Then the next picture was the animals coming to make friends with him. Then there was a third picture with a few monks who had joined him. And then there was the fourth picture was a whole monastery of, and finally when you went around the room, the last picture was the Grand Duke of Russia coming to Zagorsk, to the Trinity Monastery to receive the blessing of
St. Sergius.
Sergius. Thank you. That is their concept. The Orthodox Church embraces the whole world.
Yeah.
They go through the whole of in their liturgy. They go through the whole history, from creation to the final judgment, and they say we are the reality of Russia, but of Russia. And the question is, what's their relationship?
One of the things that interested me looking at the Carey files was this question of understanding. That I can see from the correspondence that people are coming to understand that they don't understand, and that the other side don't understand either. In other words, you're beginning to realise that what you mean by different things, theologically, as you know, in church circles as well as politically, are different to one another. So, in a way, do you think the context of the Cold War actually helped you get a deeper understanding of your Christian fellows from other faiths behind the Iron Curtain?
Yeah.
Well, you know what? We were an ecumenical organization. I mean, truly ecumenical. Almost all of us were members of different churches.
Yeah.
Starting with Mennonites and the Church of the Brethren on the Peace Church tradition, all the way to Episcopalian and Roman Catholics.
And where we had
and actually Orthodox. Not many Orthodox, but there were people like Kiszkowski who were Orthodox participants in that process. And it's interesting, our denominational differences never interfered in our relationship. We lived ecumenism. We were as if we were really one single church body in a way, right?
Yes.
We worshiped together before our meetings. We prayed. We discussed. Sometimes we had fairly lively differences of opinion how to approach things and so on. But we worked very well, and we did have usually some churches on that side of the divide who were members of our own denominations. Mm-hmm. So you're Lutheran, and there were Lutheran churches in the East. Mm-hmm. And you're Presbyterian, and there were Reformed churches in the East. And I'm Methodist, and there were Methodist churches in the East. So we were able to...
And Orthodox.
And so we were able to work with the people who were members of our own church communities and have something in common right there and there and understand each other. We had this ability to figure out how this works. And then we thought that our role was basically twofold in Korea, I think, as I understand it. One of them was to keep on that channels of communication open and to present our witness as Christians from a different part of the world than theirs, right? And then on the other hand, we always had this awareness that many people in our own country had no understanding and no appreciation of what was going on the other side, had an automatic position of animosity, and were willing to almost go to a nuclear war in order to show the supremacy of our way of life and so on. And then we started we understood that we had a function also of disseminating information, right? That's when we started publishing, first the occasional papers on religion in Eastern Europe, then later on that got transfigured into religion in Eastern Europe. We started publishing books and so on, by which we were hoping to communicate to different people who were increasingly traveling to Eastern Europe, to be able to go knowing what was going on. You told me earlier before we started this discussion that you went to Geneva really quite innocent of what was going on in Eastern Europe, and that it was very helpful to you when people like that German. Tell us that story. That's a very good story, I think, of how you got to Geneva. And
Well, when I came to Geneva in 1985, two quick stories. An Oberkirchenrat from the Württembergische Landeskirche, who was on my commission, came especially to Geneva to have lunch with me. The only item on the agenda is to try to get me to understand the German Lutheran churches, which I certainly didn't understand at all.
85, he said.
Oh, 1985.
But more interestingly, that same year, I had been in Geneva only 2 or 3 months, and I had no international experience particularly. I traveled a fair amount, but in an executive position, and I went with a meeting, on a meeting of about half a dozen people who were responsible for communication in ecumenical and church organizations. Metropolitan Peter was there from Moscow, and some other, about half a dozen of us in Budapest. And we met with the Minister for Religious Affairs of the Hungarian Communist government. And he was most gracious, and we were in a beautiful room. And
What year was this?
1985.
85.
And he asked us to introduce ourselves. And he knew everybody, but when I came to me, I said my name, and he stopped me right away. And he said he wanted to welcome me to his country and to this group. And he said, I want you also to know that we know everything about you. The LWF had its assembly in Budapest, and I was elected at that assembly. But I was not there at that assembly. The previous year, 1984, the first ecumenical organization to have its assembly behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. And I had been elected, and they had investigated me. And they quite properly said, we know everything about you. And I just asked myself, what in the world have I gotten into? I had been in my job about 2 months. But that taught me, too, some realities of circumstances in other parts of the world that I was totally unfamiliar with.
A question to you about that assembly in Budapest in the communist period, 1985, right?
84.
84.
Yeah.
What was your reaction to the election of a Lutheran bishop from Hungary? I've forgotten his name.
Zoltán Kaldi.
Yes, as president of the
Yeah.
Lutheran Road Federation.
Yeah.
That was much criticized in the West. And what is your take on it?
Well, it was an enormous struggle. I wasn't at the assembly, but I did get to know Bishop Kaldi. The tradition since 1947 at every assembly of the Lutheran World Federation was that someone from the host church or the host country was elected president. So you had Anders Nygren, the first president, and the LWF was started in Sweden. And Franklin Clark V was president when they had the Minneapolis assembly. No, Frederick Schutz, excuse me, not Franklin Clark V. Kaldi, the assembly was in Budapest. Kaldi had a history because Lutherans since the 1950s were very much aware of Bishop Ordas,
Yes.
who had been bishop of the Lutheran Church in Hungary and was placed under house arrest 2 different times by the communist government.
Yeah.
And Caldi came in as bishop of the church when Ordas was under house arrest.
Yeah.
And Caldi was regarded by, split the church psychologically, if not administratively. And Caldi was regarded by many really as a fellow traveler. He was a member of the Parliament of Hungary, but that was a sort of regarded by some as an honorific thing. The bishop of the church.
Yeah, all the bishops were automatically
became members of Parliament.
Ex officio, in a sense.
And the election was bitter. It was the first contested election in the history of the Lutheran World Federation. A woman from Denmark was the primary candidate against Caldi. There was an incident at the assembly associated with a dissident, a Lutheran pastor named Doka.
Also Zoltán Doka.
Zoltán
right?
Doka,
Yeah,
and you may know more about this than I do, but he tried to get the assembly to take a stand against Caldi and the leadership of the host church, the Lutheran Church of Hungary. The government, of course, was behind Caldi, and the assembly could never have been held without the total approval of the government.
Of course.
And a person like one of the leaders in our Cold War study, Risto Lehtinen, was heavily involved in negotiations with the government. He discovered afterwards, since, that the government had a code name for him, coming in from Geneva to Budapest. Caldi was elected. We'll never really know. I met him a couple of times. Within 2 years, though, he had a stroke and was incapacitated and died shortly thereafter. He had a stroke in the Zurich airport, flying back to Budapest from Geneva. And the German vice president, Johannes Hanselmann, became president. But the story of the Hungarian Lutheran Church between the period of Ordas and Caldi is still going on. It's not a united church at this point.
A lot of debate.
There is debate, controversy, enmity within that church. Going back to the period when the primary question was between being a member of the church and the role of the government in connection with it.
So this is a legacy of the Cold War.
Yes,
these
indeed.
divisions within the churches.
They've been solved much easier in some countries than in others. And Hungary is not a good story. And I understand it's not a good story for the Reformed Church.
That's right.
Which is larger than the Lutheran
Church. You could be
Church.
describing the conflict in the Reformed Church as well.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting what you're saying about they knew everything there was to know about you in 1985, which is in the final years of the Cold War. The Cold War was really drawing to a close because clearly the communist authorities then throughout the Cold War saw religion as very important, and particularly, I mean, the archival evidence shows that they did feel that the American churches in particular were very important as politically, that they could have an influence politically. So in a way it makes sense that they would want to know who the churchmen were, particularly those churchmen who were interested in and coming to Eastern Europe, because what they would hope, obviously, is that you would influence a more benign policy, shall we say, toward them back home, that you would spread understanding.
Well, this is one of the hard lessons that I learned. I never had any connection with the Christian Peace Conference, for example. I knew about it, but I was not involved. And it was startling to me when I came to Geneva in the Lutheran World Federation to realize how seriously governments behind the Iron Curtain took church bodies, ecumenical bodies, confessional body or the churches themselves. It was inconceivable to me that there should be a minister for religious affairs, as there was in virtually all of
In
those
every
countries.
country.
Yes,
But
but not in the West.
not in the West. I mean, you know, who takes church seriously in the West was sort of the attitude that I had, and that was a great learning. I had other experiences, and maybe this would add a little dimension to this conversation. We've spoken only about East-West in terms of Europe and Soviet Union, United States, this sort of thing, but the global character of the Cold War and how it affected the Third World came to me most directly in Ethiopia, which beginning in the 1980s, during the time of the first of the more recent famines, the Lutheran Church in Ethiopia, the Mekane Yesus Church, became the fastest growing Lutheran church in the world. And it might still be, for all I know. There's over 10 million Lutherans in Ethiopia. Wow. And the Lutheran World Federation had with the financial support largely from Sweden and the United States, established in the 1950s the most powerful radio station in all of Africa. It had 20 studios, and the signal went all the way to Hong Kong. It was called Radio Voice of the Gospel. And in 1976 or 77, when Mengistu became the communist leader of Ethiopia, that station suddenly became the voice of revolutionary Ethiopia. The communists just took it over. And one of my jobs was to negotiate with the communist government when I came in more than 10 years later, a compensation claim with the communist government. An extraordinary experience for me personally, and I was the first Westerner back into the radio station. And it was a mess. They had destroyed the greatest tape collection of indigenous African music that existed in the world. The communists just smashed it to pieces. But much of what the communists knew about the Lutheran World Federation, they learned from East Germany. My department had a German language news service that went to East Germany as well as West Germany. And before it could be distributed in East Germany, it had to be reviewed by the authorities. And sometimes they would not allow a particular issue to be distributed to the churches. And one of those issues, and I was the one responsible ultimately, even though I didn't know it was going on, had criticized human rights abuses in Ethiopia. And it was just before...
Under Mengistu.
Under Mengistu. And it was just before the Lutheran World Federation had a council meeting in Addis Ababa, under Mengistu, still. But the Ethiopian government tried really to get us out of holding that meeting. And they learned about it from East Germany. And from the German language edition. The General Secretary called into his office not only the German language journalist, but me, and sort of read the riot act to us about not knowing the world. But the communist world was very interrelated. And a power like East Germany made sure that satellite countries knew what was relevant for them.
In this connection, or in connection with Ethiopia, quite a different story. I've forgotten his name now, but it'll come to me. But he came, an Ethiopian priest, came to study for the doctorate at Princeton Seminary.
Oh yeah.
And he got his doctorate, and he went back to Ethiopia and became a bishop. Bishop Paulos, is what his name was.
He became the archbishop, the What do they call it?
He became, that was later.
Oh, okay.
First, he was imprisoned by the Mengistu crowd and deprived of his bishopric. And the question was, how could we get him out? Princeton Seminary was involved. Jim McCord, as the president of the seminary, was involved. He was I'm sorry, I correct. He had to finish his doctorate at Princeton Seminary. And so that was the basis on which to get him out of prison. But Bishop Jim McCord, as president of the seminary, good Presbyterian, thoroughly Presbyterian. He knew Bishop Todt in Budapest, Hungary, who was we've talked about him, and he asked Todt if he could use his influence through the Christian Peace Conference to get to get Bishop Paulus out of prison, and through that influence, and what arguments Todt used, I don't know, but he probably said it was contrary to their interests to have this man in prison. So Bishop Paulus was released from prison and sent to Budapest, and from there he came back here and completed his doctorate, and eventually went back to become the patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church.
I didn't know that story. I had dinner with him when he was the next morning flying back to Addis Ababa to become patriarch. And there was no particular reason, but he said to me, he took my name and address and said, if anything bad happens, I'm going to get in touch with you. Nothing, I never heard from him again. He died just a year or so ago.
He died last year.
Yeah.
That's actually quite an amazing story in showing the different dimensions of religion and the Cold War globally, and particularly the communist dimension. I think it's probably a good time to stop.